As the world is witnessing the horrific aggression by Russia in Ukraine, many Syrians are seeing a repeat of what they are still living to this day. From deliberate targeting of civilian infrastructure, scorched earth bombing campaigns, and even siege and starve tactics. Many analysts saying that Russia is using the Syrian playbook in Ukraine. Tune in as we discuss with our guest Abdul-Rasheed al-Khateeb, a teacher and analyst from the Levant region, about Russia's intervention in Syria and how it paved the way for its invasion and occupation of Ukraine today. Join us to hear more on the Levant 24 podcast. Assalamu alaikum, I'm your host Khaled, and welcome back to another episode of the Levant 24 podcast from Idlib, Syria. Today we have an esteemed guest whose name is Abdul-Rasheed al-Khateeb. He has been in Syria now for over 5 years. He is from the Levant region, also known as Greater Syria. He is a teacher and has studied English literature in both Europe and the Americas. He is currently working in the education sector and managing humanitarian projects. He has a strong passion for advocacy of human rights, geopolitics, and religion. He currently resides in the liberated territories and has dedicated his life to serving the oppressed people of Syria. Abdul-Rasheed, assalamu alaikum. It's a pleasure to have you with us today. I think we're just going to get straight into the topic because the whole world is talking about it. Ukraine, Russia. And, as you know, being here in Syria, we've seen no shortage of, Russian war crimes and Russian, you could say...
aggression.
Exactly, yeah. Aggression against, people. Many analysts would say that Russia's intervention in Syria back in 2015 actually paved the way, for its, occupation and attack in Ukraine in 2022. What's your thoughts on this?
Yes, what you mentioned is true. When Russia entered the war in 2015, many of the tactics that we've seen them use here, firsthand on the ground, indiscriminate bombing, or not indiscriminate, rather I should say intentional targeting of civilian infrastructure, such as hospitals, schools, water treatment plants, bakeries, marketplaces, places that internationally are accepted to be off limits, or tactics that were used here and in fact developed here. As you mentioned, many analysts have mentioned this, and authors and individuals specializing in this specific field of study. Recently I heard an interview with Anna Boshskaya. She was speaking about this. She wrote a book called Putin's War in Syria. And she mentioned that all the things that we have seen so far, now we're maybe about a month in to the quote-unquote what Putin deems a special operation or an invasion of Ukraine.
Sending peacekeeping troops to Ukraine,
And we're seeing now, as their land troops aren't able to make headway, that they're falling back to what many of the analysts are referring to as the Syrian playbook, which, as we mentioned, and as we've seen, is primarily putting pressure on the civilian populations with the goal of emptying out places. You want to make a city uninhabitable so that the people have no choice at all except for to leave. And this was one of the things that we've seen mentioned about the so-called use of humanitarian corridors.
I think, you mentioned, Jazakallah khair, you mentioned a very important point. Not only militarily did they develop themselves, their tactics, even their weapons. I think it was the defense minister of Russia. He said that they tested over 320 different weapons in Syria. And obviously these weapons weren't tested in the eastern deserts of Syria. They were tested, on the heads of civilians. And also another thing that they sort of, one of the things you could say that they learnt from their, occupation and invasion of Syria is how to use politics, and especially, coming under the band of like humanitarian, we're hearing that they want to open humanitarian corridors, for civilians to leave, and, how they use, the humanitarian side as basically as a tactic of war, like they did in Aleppo, like they did in Ghouta.
They use them as a cover. Yeah, as I mentioned, many of them mentioned, for example, they said, don't be surprised if, and then we have now seen talks of humanitarian corridors, because they said primarily what Russia did in Syria, they would put such pressure on the people in the region and then they would say, quote unquote, to open a humanitarian corridor. Even during those times of evacuation, as we've seen many times, they will still harass the people, continue to shell, continue to bomb, so that what they're really doing is, many people mentioned here in Syria or even in Ukraine, is it's a form of ethnic cleansing. What they're doing is these humanitarian corridors are anything but humane. They're there to depopulate regions, remove the indigenous population, whether based on their ethnic composition or their religious or linguistic compositions, and remove them from those areas so that they can later be filled with other people. The same thing for ceasefires. They mentioned that, ceasefires and quote unquote de-escalation is always used by the Russian military as a form of to regroup and to buy a little bit more time or to reposition so that they can continue to apply pressure either to that region or to other regions as they empty them out.
Yeah, and that's something we've seen, in every battle since the Russian, intervention, occupation of Syria in 2015. Almost every major battle we've seen this. At the start of the offensives, there'll be like a big media campaign. There'll be a lot of pressure. I wouldn't say it's an extreme amount of pressure, but there'll be some type of, you could say, reaction from the international community. And Russia knows if they just, throw in a couple of words, you might pacify the international community enough, as you mentioned before, to sort of regroup, to re-strengthen, and just to maneuver, basically. Hence using it as a tactic of war. And we've seen this many times, and many people will say that, like, look, Russia, everything that's happened in Ukraine in the past weeks has been happening in Syria, for 5-6 years now. And, many of the Syrians, or pretty much all the Syrians that I've met, they've said the same thing, that what's happening now in Ukraine is due to the fact that the international community, in particular the West, EU, that they turned a blind eye to Russia's, tactics and Russia's war crimes in Syria. What's your thoughts on this? What's your opinions on this?
Yeah, I wanted to touch on one point you mentioned just briefly about the media. One thing I've observed, I'm sure we all have observed, and I've heard many pundits, those working in the field of media, and other analysts as well mentioning, is that the media in general, and people also these days, have a very short attention span.
Yeah.
If we look, maybe in the first few months, maybe the first year, you're going to see a lot of, I don't know if people remember, even here in Syria, there was a lot of attention from the international community. There was discussions of no-fly zones. We're hearing about Ukraine as well. There's discussions of providing both lethal and non-lethal aid to opposition. There was lots of aid coming in. And now we're at a point where the people in these territories, maybe, I've heard one person recently say, as many as 40,000 people might be at risk, or 60% of the population is at risk of starvation, as the last humanitarian corridor might be closed by Russia, who has a permanent seat on the United Nations Security Council, as a retaliatory act for them not achieving their goals in the Ukraine. So one of the issues is, it's not that people don't care about Syria or never did, or that didn't care about Ukraine, but that the attention given by governments, organizations, and the media, very short-lived. So that was one of the first points.
Do you think, just to add on to that point, because you mentioned something that's very, very important, and I think it's very important to differentiate between, governments and policymakers of countries, and obviously the citizens themselves, And do you believe that, Western powers and countries that actually have some type of capability, you could say, to change the dynamics of the battlefield, do you think that they're reassessing and reevaluating this?
From what I've listened from, ourselves, we're not politicians, we're not military leaders.
Thank God.
Alhamdulillah. But there's a shift amongst at least many analysts and those who are commenting. Some of them, former retired generals, members of NATO, members of the UN, who've been mentioning and observing that if a big change doesn't occur now, then basically it's giving Putin and other countries, other bad agents, free will, or carte blanche as it is, to continue upping the ante. So that they're saying we're now at a crossroads. We saw in Syria that the idea might have been, okay, they're just terrorists, or it's in a region that's not of concern to us. But now that we've seen that everything that has occurred in Syria is now occurring
front doors of Europe.
Yes, in the Ukraine, and after that, then strikes have been occurring on the border with Poland, and Poland, as we know, is a NATO member. And will Putin be satisfied with Ukraine?
Yeah, yeah, and it seems like it's not going to stop at Ukraine, And many analysts have said that, this is not something new. We shouldn't be surprised. It didn't just come out of nowhere. In fact, in 2014, since the annexation of Crimea, Russia's been very clear. Even in the 90s, to be honest, they've been consistent in saying that, look, they're going to take Ukraine.
Yes.
I think it's like the world just sort of preferred, because look, let's be real. No one likes war. No one likes death. No one likes, hardships. And the conflict in Ukraine is affecting the whole world, if not morally, at least financially, economically.
And as far as food, majority
Exactly.
of the grain surpluses we're now seeing
Exactly.
in the southern hemisphere, there's a lot of issues. It's
Yeah.
wide impacting.
We're actually feeling it here in
Yes,
northern
yeah.
Idlib, and in Syria in general, even in the areas of the regime. Because I think Russia is the biggest exporter of wheat. And
The
even
supplier of
sunflower
Bashar Assad's regime, yeah.
Yeah, exactly.
And
It's
they've
basically
been
the
cut
life-
back now, yeah.
Yeah,
That's true.
And even petroleum and things like that. So maybe some regions they might be able to cope, but Syria is highly dependent, on imports. Imports? Yeah, on imports coming from that region. So nobody wants war, but when you're faced with an aggressive tyrant, like Putin, who's invading, countries and killing people, and you're forced to react. You're forced to defend, and this is what's been happening in Syria, for the last 11 years. But as we've seen from the Syrian people, and as the whole world's seen from the Ukrainian people as well, the resistance, the will, the determination to resist this occupation, and this attack. Do you believe that this will and determination, of the people, whether they be in Ukraine or Syria, is enough to, repel and resist, Russia's attack?
I think it's unfortunately going to have to be. And as you mentioned, this is something that both we've seen on the ground here. It's not just the determination of the Syrian people, but the same thing in Ukraine. When the people when their land is invaded and their livelihood, their homes, their families are threatened, their sovereignty is put at risk, then they will rise up and do what they must do to protect themselves. But I just wanted to add to that, as much as we've seen how the determination of the Syrian people has gotten them through over a decade of war, when nations have come, when in the beginning, as you know, we've spoken with people were going out in the streets with sticks and pistols and
Yeah.
nothing else,
literally,
when they had planes and helicopters over their heads. So yes, the people should maintain their determination, and I've heard this from many of the opposition leaders and Syrian people themselves to the Ukrainians, but also I would say the international community needs to be determined, and they need to put their foot down, and they need to say, look, enough is enough. If they're not willing to stand up for their principles, or they're going to have their hands tied by unjust laws and rules that they've put upon themselves, as many have mentioned, the United Nations Security Council and Russia's veto, if you're going to let an aggressing and oppressing nation dictate to you what it can and cannot do, then we're in no moral position to complain at the outcome.
Yeah, I mean that's a fair statement, and many Syrians that I've sat with, to be honest, a lot of Syrians actually feel a bit betrayed, by the we've all seen on the media a lot of double standards, to how the international community, has dealt with the Ukrainian conflict as opposed to the conflict here in Syria. Yeah, many locals that I've spoken with, to be honest, they actually feel betrayed by the international community. And it's not because they put all their reliance on the international community. It's more that they're seeing so many double standards, in front of their eyes, things that, in the last couple of weeks of the conflict in Ukraine, we're seeing how Ukrainian refugees are being treated, as opposed to even foreigners that are living in Ukraine. We're seeing in terms of support, by Western powers, how much support they've delivered to the Ukrainian people, to the Ukrainian army, to repel Russia's aggression. And the Syrian people feel betrayed because everyone knows since the start, one of the main difficulties that the Syrian people faced in their uprising against the regime, one of the main, you could say, strategic hardships that the Syrian people faced was some type of defense against air attacks by the regime and by Russia. And this is where the most devastating blow happens, to civilians, to the infrastructure, like you mentioned at the beginning. And we've seen it in Ukraine. All these airstrikes we've seen, hitting residential areas, hitting, hospitals,
maternity wards.
I mean, this is something, I can't count the number of hospitals that have been hit in Syria. I'm sure it's over 100. There's been many documentations. And,
even in
research on
12 hours, they hit like 4 or 5 hospitals.
Yeah, the New York Times done an investigative piece on this. Yeah, exactly. So many Syrians, they actually, feel betrayed by the international community. I mean, imagine they had, the same capabilities or less, just a little bit less than what Ukraine has now. Yeah. Anti-air defense, javelins.
The javelins,
yes. Yeah.
Yeah. So it's a good point, and this is something I've heard mentioned many times, that the disparity between how these two conflicts have been treated when the actors more or less are the same. You have Russia coming in using the exact same tactics, and these things were discussed as I've seen videos 6 years ago, 3 years ago, 4 years ago, when they were discussing this very thing regarding Russia's war or intervention in Syria and its possible future impact on specifically Ukraine. So when there's a sense of betrayal, it's not as if no one had any inkling that Putin or Russia was thinking of this. And when we saw the results in Syria, why wasn't anything done? It's not just the Syrian people who were betrayed, but the Ukrainian people by the international community. And you made a very good point. Yes, even the aid in Ukraine, the javelin systems, anti-tank and light anti-aircraft munitions, the lethal aid they've been receiving, as well as the non-lethal aid, this is beneficial. But even members of NATO, members of various militaries, are saying that's not even enough. Yeah. So then what about the Syrian people who have more or less received nothing? Yeah. You have the same Russian aircraft, reconnaissance aircraft, and bombing platforms that are flying over the skies of Syria and terrorizing women and children in their schools are the same ones, even the same pilots that were killing people in Syria are now killing people in Ukraine.
Yeah, it's crazy.
And one of the most, touching things that really shook my heart that I heard was hearing a Syrian doctor who used to work in Aleppo advising Ukrainian medical staff, just turn your patients over quickly. Even if you know someone needs a week in the hospital, get them out in 2 days, because they will target your hospital.
Their lives are at risk by being in a hospital.
Exactly.
Wow.
And he said, if I could go to Ukraine, he contacted various organizations, because I'm ready to go to Ukraine and do the same medical work for the Ukrainian people that I did here in Syria for my people.
And that just speaks volumes about the Syrian people, to be honest, We have one, if we want to look at things from Russia's point of view now, because obviously there's always two sides to any conflict. Russia will say that, Ukraine, they're trying to become part of NATO, they're a threat to Russia.
Denazification.
Exactly, and there are neo-Nazis. Like we've seen. It's not like it's it's not true. It is true. So these are obviously the narratives and the things that Putin's promoting, and there is some truth to it.
Yes, this is a very good point, and it's the same tactics. Even the political and the propaganda tactics that are being used in Ukraine are the same that were being used in Syria. Ostensibly, what did Russia claim it was doing in Syria? It was a war on specifically the Islamic State, or ISIS, and quote-unquote terrorists. But I believe I heard a recent, or saw some statistics recently, that were saying that more than 90% of all the strikes were on opposition only. Yeah. They weren't actually even striking ISIS targets. They were just striking pockets of armed opposition. But more than that even, they were emptying the civilian sectors. Like one of the longest siege in recent history of Ghouta in Shem was quote-unquote broken by the Russian intervention, and it was the scorched earth policies that they used. And all the time they were saying, we're fighting terrorists. And what are they doing now in Ukraine? They're going to fight extremists, Nazis. They're protecting these people who are being oppressed by the right wing, or they're liberating a territory.
there's one thing that I can't sort of wrap my head around, because, and this falls under the category of double standards, If Russia was America, one thing that, many people say is that Russia's doing exactly the same thing that, for example, America or the US would do. I mean, the US waged wars, and I don't want to get too deep on the topic, but waged wars in places far away from their borders with people that weren't a threat to them. And yet Russia, as they claim, they're trying to protect their borders and protect their sovereignty and et cetera, Yani. So some people sort of question, the Western narrative that's been promoted on this, on the conflict, that why is the US or Europe in a moral position to speak about this war when they would do the exact same thing if they were in Russia's shoes, basically?
Well, in this case, you touched on a key point. One of the main things you mentioned is moral position. And as you mentioned earlier, a lot of times I think we confuse policy and politics with morality and humanity. One unique aspect of Islam is that our system is comprehensive. No. Ostensibly, we don't differentiate between, politics and morals because they go hand in hand. Our religion and our morality dictates our decisions. Unfortunately, the world today is governed more or less by a system wherein to do what is right, morally correct, they would have to break the laws that they've imposed upon themselves. There was a quote I once read regarding Anne Frank, where they mentioned that, the ones who killed Anne Frank were obeying the law, and the ones who hit her were breaking the law. So if you're faced with a position where following the law, following the rules, compels you to do what's immoral or inhumane, then what you should do really is question that system that has put you in that position. Yeah. So what's the moral difference between this country or that country? I would say there's no difference. But we shouldn't look at, is it this country or that country which is doing it, but go back to the source and the asl of what you mentioned, or the origin, which is this right? Is this just? Yeah. Is this moral?
Yeah, barakallahu feek. And it's very important that you touched on that, because it's, especially in this day and age with social media and so much propaganda, misinformation, it's easy to get caught up and be strayed. I wanted to just maybe discuss this. Maybe this can be like the last topic we discuss. And the reason why I want to speak about this briefly is because many Syrians and even people around the world who are sympathetic to the Syrian cause are constantly asking, will the conflict in Ukraine with Russia weaken Russia's position in Syria and allow, the Free Syrian people to be able to re-liberate their areas and return home? Or does it have no effect in Syria?
Well, first we're saying Allah knows best, what the future will hold. Yeah, no. But this seems to be something that there's difference of opinion upon, from different analysts, from different specialists in those fields, which I'm not specifically. But we've seen that Russia, since it began its offensive in the Ukraine, has decreased a lot of its military activities here. On top of that, many analysts have mentioned that the Russian military doesn't have the capacity to wage war on multiple fronts. And these two spheres are interconnected, just as we see the experience of the Syrian people and that of the Ukrainian people mirror one another. And just as we've seen that the events in the Ukraine has a global impact, it's only logical, to follow through that, of course, Russia's the outcome of the conflict in the Ukraine does impact, for good or bad, the Syrian conflict. Whether or not that would allow the Syrian people to return back to their homes, to live in peace, and to achieve the right of self-determination without being oppressed and harmed and attacked by Russia or other countries, we can only hope. We can only hope.
Jazakallah khair. I think one thing that I'd like to get your opinion on before we wrap up is, obviously you live amongst the Syrian people, you work with them, you interact with them daily. What's their thoughts and their, feelings about, that you've noticed, Yani? What's their thoughts and their feelings towards the Ukrainian conflict and Ukrainian people in particular?
The vast majority, which you may have touched on in the beginning, I don't recall specifically, but the vast majority, as I'm sure you know, or anyone here knows, is they feel that the Ukrainian people are like them. I've heard many say that no one can understand what Ukraine and the Ukrainians are going through except us, because we've lived that same terror. For a doctor, one of the safest place, a hospital, or a school, or a place of worship, for you to have to fear for your life to go to those places and to hide your hospitals and to not send your children to school, it's something that no one can really think of. And to see the exact same things, the exact same type of images coming out of Ukraine that these people have lived through, their hearts are with the Ukrainian people.
Yeah, and
are ours as well. We're people. Despite differences in religion or culture or languages, at the end of the day, we're all human beings. Just going back to what you mentioned before, is that let's not make everything so much about politics, but let's focus on the humanity and the common grounds and what is universally agreed upon to be right and wrong, moral and immoral, just and unjust.
Abdul-Rasheed al-Khateeb, it's been an absolute pleasure speaking with you today, and I look forward to speaking with you again in the future.
Inshallah. Thank you for having me.
Jazakallah khair.